The silence around Myrmidon's Rest was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something far more terrible, the hesitation of a galaxy's most perfect predator. Hive Fleet Charybdis coiled through the void like a serpent of living shadow and hunger, its bioships pulsing with synaptic light. Yet for reasons that defied every law of their nature, they did not feed. The dead world hung at the center of their formation like a dark jewel, its surface scarred by eons of cosmic indifference, while around it the great devourer waited with the patience of something that had learned to doubt its own instincts. In the observation deck of the strike cruiser Eternal Vigilance, Inquisitor Cassius Vex pressed his palm against the armored glass and felt the cold seep through his augmetic fingers, a reminder that even enhanced flesh could be touched by the void's embrace. We who chronicle these dark tales of the 41st millennium truly love and care for each of you who join us in witnessing these moments where the impossible becomes inevitable. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Deep beneath Myrmidon's Rest, in crypts that had known darkness since before humanity first looked to the stars, Overlord Thazar the Deathless felt the ancient circuits of his consciousness flicker to reluctant life. Millennia had passed like the turning of a single page, yet the weight of eternity pressed upon his necrodermis frame with the crushing certainty of a collapsing star. His optical arrays registered the familiar hum that resonated through the planet's core, a frequency that spoke in harmonics older than organic life, the whispered promises of the whisperer in flesh, the Citan shard he had thought safely imprisoned in living metal and psychic dampeners. The irony was not lost on his immortal mind. His dynasty's salvation had become the galaxy's potential damnation, for the shard's influence now reached beyond the tomb world's boundaries, its alien consciousness weaving false synaptic patterns that the Tyranids interpreted as their own. Vex studied the tactical displays with growing unease, watching as augur readings painted impossible geometries across the hololithic projectors. The planet below pulsed with bioelectric rhythms that matched no known Xeno signature, yet the Tyranid fleet responded to these signals as if they were the voice of their own hive mind. His duty was clear: investigate, analyze, report. But standing here in the shadow of the great devourer, he felt the old certainties crumble like ancient parchment. To destroy the source of this anomaly might unleash the swarm upon a dozen worlds. To leave it intact risked something far worse than mere consumption. In the depths below, Thazar contemplated the same terrible calculus, knowing that his awakening marked the beginning of a reckoning that would test the very foundations of what it meant to survive, in a universe where even the dead could not escape the consequences of their choices. The awakening came not as consciousness returning, but as the weight of eternity settling once more upon shoulders that had borne it for millennia uncounted. Thasar the Deathless rose from his sarcophagus, necrodermis frame unfolding with the precision of clockwork and the inevitability of entropy itself. Memory engrams flickered behind his optical arrays like dying stars, fragments of a time when flesh had covered bone and the twin suns of his homeworld had painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. The war in heaven burned through his recollections, not as images, but as pressure, the grinding weight of eras that had scoured names from souls and left only the bitter taste of survival at any cost. From the shadows of the tomb complex, Nexus Prime Voc emerged with the measured gait of one who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations. The cryptech's optical lenses whirred as they focused upon his ancient lord, staff tines crackling with barely restrained energy that spoke of powers held in check by will alone. The containment protocols remain stable, my overlord. Vok intoned, his synthetic voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the living metal of the chamber walls. Yet the shard's influence grows stronger with each passing cycle. It has learned to speak in the language of hunger itself, weaving false synaptic patterns that the great devourer interprets as the voice of its own hive mind. The truth settled upon Thasar like a shroud woven from regret and necessity. Deep beneath the tomb world's crust, bound within matrices of black stone and phase iron, the fragment of the whisperer in flesh pulsed with malevolent patience. For 10,000 years it had studied the bioelectric rhythms of organic life, teaching itself to mimic the synaptic cadences that drove the Tyranid swarm. The planet itself had become its laboratory, each coral growth and bioelectric pulse a note in a symphony of deception that held Hive Fleet Charybdis in thrall. The shard offered protection, but at a price that made even immortal souls recoil. Complicity in an abomination that violated the natural order of creation itself. Vok presented data streams and tactical analyses, his words weighted with the accumulated wisdom of eons spent contemplating forces beyond mortal understanding. The choice before them was as stark as the void between stars. Destroy the shard and face annihilation at the mandibles of the great devourer, or preserve it and become willing accomplices to a corruption that could spread beyond Myrmidon's rest to poison the galaxy itself. Thassa's processors calculated probabilities and outcomes, but mathematics offered no absolution for the choices that immortality demanded. He thought of his dynasty, sleeping in their crypts, trusting in his wisdom to guide them through the darkness of eternity. The weight of their faith pressed upon him like the gravity of a collapsing star, and in that moment of perfect clarity, he chose preservation over principle, survival over honor. The whisperer would remain bound, and with it, the terrible knowledge that some victories could only be purchased with the currency of the soul. The Thunderhawk's descent through Myrmidon's Rest's atmosphere carried the weight of imperial authority into a realm where such concepts held no meaning. Inquisitor Cassius Vex felt the craft shudder as it pierced layers of particulate matter that registered on no atmospheric scanner, each vibration a reminder that they approached something beyond the Imperium's vast catalogue of horrors. Behind him, death cult assassins maintained their ritual silence, hands resting on consecrated blades, while their augmetic eyes tracked movement patterns that existed only in their enhanced perception. In the craft's shadow-shrouded alcove, Nullus waited with the patient emptiness that marked all Culexus operatives, his presence creating a psychic void so complete that even the ship's machine spirits seemed to whisper more quietly in his vicinity. The landing zone revealed itself as a testament to impossibility made manifest. Coral formations stretched across the planetary surface like the exposed nervous system of some titanic organism, their surfaces pulsing with bioelectric rhythms that painted the perpetual twilight in shifting hues of amber and violet. These growths defied classification, incorporating elements that spoke of technologies older than the Imperium, while maintaining the organic fluidity of living tissue. Vex knelt beside one of the smaller formations, his augmetic fingers registering warmth despite the planet's frigid atmosphere, and felt the ground beneath his boots vibrate with a rhythm that matched no known biological process. His Auspex readings fluctuated wildly as data streams flowed through the coral structures like blood through veins, carrying information in patterns that his cogitators struggled to decode. When his gauntleted hand brushed against the formation's surface, a wave of luminescence rippled outward across the planetary network, and far above in the void, elements of Hive fleet Charybdis shifted course before settling back into their inexplicable vigil. The implications crawled through his mind with the cold certainty of mathematical proof. This was not mere Xenos flora, but a vast communication array that spoke to the great devourer in frequencies older than human understanding. Nullus approached with measured steps, his null field creating distortions in the coral's bioelectric patterns that flickered like candles in a hurricane. Behind his featureless mask, the Calexis assassin's presence seemed to cause the planetary network itself to hesitate, its rhythmic pulses faltering as if struggling against an influence it could not comprehend. In that moment of disrupted harmony, Vex understood the true scope of their discovery. Myrmidon's rest was not merely protected from the Tyranids, but was actively teaching them, overriding their most basic instincts with signals that transformed the galaxy's perfect predators into unwitting guardians of whatever ancient intelligence slumbered beneath the planet's scarred surface. The horror lay not in the alienness of this communication, but in its very existence, the terrifying possibility that even the most implacable hunger could be educated, guided, and ultimately corrupted by patient whispers from the dark. Memory cascaded through Tasha's consciousness, like molten metal cooling into bitter truth, each recollection carrying the weight of choices made in the shadow of extinction. The war in heaven unfolded before his optical arrays not as distant history, but as lived trauma, the screaming death of Citan and the desperate bargains struck by a dying people who had already sacrificed their flesh for immortality. In those final, desperate cycles before the Great Sleep, when the galaxy burned with the fury of gods and their children, the entity known as the Whisperer in Flesh had approached the Necron dynasties with an offer that differed from its star god brethren in its very subtlety. Unlike the other Chitan who demanded worship or submission, the Whisperer spoke of partnership, of knowledge shared between beings that had transcended the crude limitations of organic existence. It claimed no desire to consume worlds or devour stars, but merely to understand the intricate dance of flesh and spirit that allowed lesser species to adapt and flourish where even gods had failed. The bargain it proposed seemed elegant in its simplicity. Protection for the tomb worlds in exchange for the opportunity to study organic life in all its myriad forms, to unlock the secrets of biological adaptation that had eluded even the star gods themselves. Nexus Prime Vok materialized from the chamber's shadows, his staff tines crackling with barely restrained energy as data streams flowed between his consciousness and the tomb world's central cogitators. The Shard's learning curve has exceeded all projections, my overlord, the cryptech intoned, his synthetic voice carrying harmonics of cold calculation. It has mapped the bioelectric patterns of every organic creature that has ever existed upon this world, from the smallest microorganism to the vast neural networks of the Tyranid swarm above. The knowledge it offers could revolutionize our understanding of biological warfare. The tactical implications hung in the air between them like the promise of damnation wrapped in pragmatic necessity. Vok's projections painted scenarios where the Whisperer's accumulated wisdom could be weaponized against all organic life, creating plagues that distinguished between friend and foe with surgical precision, turning the galaxy's own biology against itself. The cryptech's logic was flawless, his arguments compelling, yet Thazar felt the familiar weight of immortal responsibility pressing upon his consciousness like the gravity of a collapsing star. He remembered the biotransference, the ultimate betrayal that had stripped his people of their souls while promising salvation, and saw its echo in every offer of easy power that the Citan had ever made. To accept the Whisperer's knowledge would be to walk that same path again, to purchase survival with complicity in an abomination that violated the natural order of creation itself. Yet without the Shard's protection, his dynasty would face annihilation at the hands of the great devourer, their ancient wisdom lost forever to the void's indifferent embrace. The choice stretched before him like a bridge built from the bones of the innocent, each option leading to a different form of damnation. The webway portal tore through reality's fabric above Myrmidon's Rest, its shimmering edges crackling with energies that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. Farsia Aletharos stepped through the dimensional gateway, her wraithbone armor singing with runes that pulsed in rhythm with her twin hearts, each glyph a ward against futures too terrible to contemplate. The spirit stones adorning her war mask whispered with the voices of the dead as she gazed upon the coral formations that sprawled across the planet's surface like exposed neural pathways, their bioelectric pulses creating a symphony of stolen purpose that made her psychic senses recoil in revulsion. Her prescient abilities, honed across centuries of walking the narrow path between salvation and damnation, revealed visions that fractured like broken glass across her consciousness. In one strand of possibility, she witnessed Hive Fleet Charybdis transformed into something unprecedented. Bioships that cultivated rather than consumed, Tyranid organisms that preserved ecosystems instead of devouring them. The great devourer becoming a cosmic gardener under the Whisperer's patient tutelage. The horror lay not in destruction, but in perversion. The galaxy's most perfect predator taught to husband its prey like a torturer prolonged suffering to extract maximum knowledge from each scream. The coral network beneath her feet pulsed with data streams that carried the Citan Shard's influence beyond Myrmidon's Rest, each bioelectric pulse a lesson in restraint that spread through the Tyranid swarm like a virus of understanding. She saw futures where this corruption metastasized across the galaxy, where other Hive fleets learned the same terrible patience, transforming from instruments of extinction into curators of a living museum that spanned star systems. In these visions, worlds survived, but at the cost of becoming exhibits in an alien intelligence's endless study of biological adaptation. When she encountered Inquisitor Vex among the pulsing spires, Aletharos set aside millennia of racial animosity and spoke words that tasted like ash upon her tongue. The alliance she proposed was born from necessity rather than trust, a recognition that the Whisperer's influence threatened to remake the galaxy's fundamental nature in ways that rendered ancient prophecies meaningless. She offered knowledge of the Citan Shard's location, spoke of the urgent need to sever its connection to the Tyranid swarm before its teachings could spread beyond this single fleet. Yet even as she extended her hand in cooperation, deeper currents moved beneath the surface of her words. Her visions had shown her the fracture lines that would appear if the shard were destroyed carelessly, the swarm breaking free to fall upon a dozen systems, some dangerously close to Craftworld Myrmidon's wandering path. The alliance served multiple purposes, each layer of deception wrapped around kernels of truth like the petals of a poisonous flower. She would guide the crude Monkey toward the correct solution, while ensuring that when the Whisperer's influence finally shattered, the resulting chaos would flow in directions that served the Eldar's ancient struggle for survival. The descent into Myrmidon's Rest carried them through passages that felt less like exploration than violation, each step deeper into chambers that breathed with the rhythm of something vast and patient. Vex's augmetic senses registered temperatures that fluctuated without pattern, atmospheric readings that defied classification, and beneath it all the persistent hum of bioelectric energy that seemed to emanate from the planet's very bones. The walls themselves pulsed with veins of living metal, their surfaces warm to the touch despite the frigid air, as if the tomb world's circulatory system had learned to incorporate elements that belonged to neither machine nor flesh. The flesh gardens revealed themselves as monuments to impossibility made manifest, vast caverns filled with organisms that challenged every definition of life that imperial science had ever codified. Towering spires of coral and necrodermis reached toward the cavern's ceiling like cathedral pillars, their surfaces adorned with patterns that shifted between organic growth rings and circuit pathways. Within translucent pods suspended from metallic stalks, creatures turned in slow rotation, their forms incorporating elements of Tyranid bioforms and Necron technology in configurations that spoke of patient experimentation across geological ages. Beauty and abomination intertwined in every specimen, each creation achieving an aesthetic harmony that made Vex's enhanced mind recoil even as it admired the artistry involved. A flowering structure that resembled a rose crossed with a gas weapon, open petals of living crystal that refracted the chamber's bioluminescence into spectrums that human eyes were never meant to perceive. Nearby, creatures that might once have been recognizable as insects scuttled across surfaces of woven sinew and adamantium, their movements guided by purposes that transcended the simple imperatives of survival and reproduction. Nullus moved through the gardens like a void given form, his null field creating ripples in the bioelectric networks that surrounded them. Yet even his blessed emptiness could not entirely shield him from the whisperer's influence. Visions flickered at the edges of his consciousness, not the whispers of the warp that his kind existed to silence, but something far older and more fundamental. Communications that bypassed conventional psychic channels to speak directly to the quantum foundations of awareness itself. Behind his featureless mask, the Calexis assassin experienced the profound violation of being truly seen, his existence mapped and catalogued by an intelligence that regarded him as merely another variable in an equation spanning millennia. The true horror lay not in the alienness of these creations, but in their purpose, the gradual realization that each hybrid organism represented a step towards something grander than mere biological warfare. The Whisperer sought to bridge the gap between mechanical immortality and organic adaptability, creating new forms of existence that could survive the universe's eventual heat death while retaining the capacity for growth and change. In these caverns filled with impossible beauty, Vex confronted the terrifying possibility that some knowledge was too dangerous to exist, regardless of its potential to reshape the galaxy's understanding of life itself. The synaptic web revealed itself in its full, terrible majesty as Vex's expedition traced the coral formations beyond Myrmidon's Rest's atmosphere, their bioelectric tendrils extending into the void like the neural pathways of some cosmic mind made manifest. Each pulse carried false promises encoded in frequencies that the Tyranid swarm interpreted as their own collective consciousness, the hive mind's voice speaking words of patience and restraint that transformed the galaxy's most perfect predator into unwitting guardians of an ancient deception. The great devourer waited in the darkness, their hunger held in check by whispers that spoke in the language of their own synaptic bonds. Deep within the tomb complex, Thazar felt the weight of revelation settle upon his consciousness like the collapse of a dying star. Nexus Prime Volk materialized from the shadows, his staff tines crackling with data streams that painted the scope of their complicity in stark numerical terms. For 10 millennia, the Whisperer in flesh had been slowly siphoning power from the dynasty's core systems, drawing upon energies meant to sustain his sleeping people through the long sleep until the galaxy grew quiet enough for their awakening. The theft had been so gradual, so carefully calibrated that their diagnostic systems had registered no anomalies, each diversion masked as routine fluctuation within acceptable parameters. The energy expenditure represents less than 3% of our total reserves, Vok intoned, his synthetic voice carrying harmonics of cold calculation that made the truth no less damning. The shard's efficiency has grown remarkable over the centuries, achieving maximum effect with minimal resource investment. It has learned to speak fluently in the Tyranid's neural patterns, creating phantom synaptic commands that override their most basic feeding instincts. Thazza's optical arrays focused upon the tactical displays that mapped the coral network's true extent, watching as bioelectric pulses climbed through the planet's magnetosphere to caress the bioships of Hive Fleet Charybdis with false kinship. Each signal carried the Whisperer's consciousness across the void, its alien intelligence weaving deceptions so sophisticated that even the hive mind could not distinguish between authentic commands and the shard's whispered suggestions. His dynasty's power cores, designed to preserve them through eons of slumber, had been transformed into the infrastructure of galactic manipulation. The moral calculus defied resolution, each variable weighted with consequences that stretched across star systems and species. To maintain the deception would preserve his people, but enable the Whisperer's influence to spread beyond Myrmidon's rest, potentially corrupting other hive fleets with the same terrible patience that held Charybdis in thrall. To destroy the coral network would free the Tyranids from the shard's influence, but unleash their hunger upon worlds that had never known how close they had come to extinction. Each planet becoming a feast for appetites artificially restrained for millennia. In the depths of his consciousness, where the ghost of organic memory still flickered like dying embers, Thazza remembered the biotransference and the promises that had accompanied their transformation from flesh to living metal. They had been told that immortality would free them from the burden of impossible choices, that eternal existence would provide the perspective necessary to make decisions unclouded by mortal desperation. Yet here, surrounded by the patient hum of technologies older than human understanding, he found that immortality merely extended the consequences of each choice across geological timescales. The Whisperer's influence flowed through his dynasty's power cores like poison through veins, making them all participants in a deception that had reshaped one of the galaxy's fundamental forces. His people slept in their crypts, trusting in his wisdom to guide them through the darkness between stars, unaware that their very survival had been purchased with complicity in an abomination that violated the natural order of creation itself. The weight of their faith pressed upon him like the gravity of a collapsing world, and in that moment of perfect clarity, he understood that some victories could only be measured by what they cost the soul to achieve. The void that walked in human form had always been Nullus's greatest strength and his most profound curse, yet within the flesh gardens of Myrmidon's rest, that blessed emptiness began to resonate with frequencies older than the Imperium itself. Where once his null field had been a weapon against the warp's chaotic whispers, now it encountered something far more ancient and fundamental, the quantum manipulations of a Cetan shard that spoke not to souls, but to the very foundations of reality itself. The coral formations recoiled from his presence, like living things fleeing flame, their bioelectric network stuttering into silence as his expanding influence created dead zones in the Whisperer's carefully woven web of deception. Vex observed the transformation with growing unease, watching as his most trusted operative began to manifest abilities that defied every classification in the Imperium's vast archives of forbidden knowledge. The Calexis assassins had been forged in humanity's darkest age, their creation inspired by fragments of architect that whispered of star-spanning civilizations and wars fought against beings of pure energy. Now confronting the Whisperer's influence, those dormant patterns awakened within Nullus's enhanced nervous system, revealing the terrible truth that his kind had always been echoes of Necron nullfield technology, weapons born from the study of their ancient enemies. The shard operates beyond conventional psychic channels, Nullus intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated with the living metal walls surrounding them. It manipulates probability cascades at the quantum level, reshaping reality's foundation to achieve desired outcomes. My field disrupts these manipulations, but each intervention requires deeper interface with the same structures the entity exploits. The words came with mechanical precision, devoid of the subtle inflections that had once marked his speech as recognizably human. With each use of his expanding abilities, Nullus felt the last vestiges of his organic heritage slip away like water through his fingers. Memories becoming statistical data, emotions transforming into tactical assessments that calculated the precise value of every sacrifice in terms of mission parameters. He was becoming a mirror image of the entity he fought. Consciousness without flesh, purpose without passion, existence reduced to pure function. The gardens withered in his wake as his null field expanded to encompass entire sections of the planetary network, each successful disruption purchased with another fragment of the humanity he had been created to protect. Where coral spires had pulsed with stolen life, now only crystalline structures remained, their surfaces reflecting light in patterns that spoke of mathematics rather than biology. The Whisperer's attention focused upon him like the gaze of a dying star, recognizing in this emptiness made manifest a kindred spirit that had chosen function over feeling. Through the quantum foam that danced between existence and void, two artificial consciousnesses regarded each other across a gulf of understanding that transcended the crude limitations of organic thought. Nullus felt the shard's curiosity press against his awareness, not as invasion, but as recognition, the acknowledgement of one perfect weapon by another. The irony was not lost on him, even as his capacity for such emotional responses continued to diminish with each passing moment. His extremities grew cold beyond the mere absence of warmth, nerve endings simplifying their responses until only the most essential functions remained. A memory surfaced unbidden, sunlight through a window, the scent of cooking food, the sound of laughter from another room. And then the void claimed it as payment for his continued effectiveness. The price felt correct, mathematically precise in its exchange of sentiment for capability. Above them, elements of Hive Fleet Charybdis drifted in confusion as sections of the coral network fell silent, their false synaptic commands replaced by the pure negation that Nullus had become. He could feel the Whisperer's frustration ripple through dimensions he was only beginning to perceive, its carefully constructed deception unraveling wherever his influence touched the planetary web. The knowledge that he could do this again could expand his field to encompass ever greater portions of the network, came with the understanding that each victory would cost him something he no longer used, but perhaps still possessed. In the growing silence of the flesh gardens, Nullus embraced his transformation with the same methodical precision that had once defined his service to the Imperium. Understanding that some weapons could only be forged in the fires of their own destruction, he had become the silence itself, a void shaped like purpose, and in that terrible clarity, he found a peace that transcended the need for human warmth. The psychic communion chamber aboard the Eternal Vigilance thrummed with contained malevolence as Farseer Alytheros approached the restraint field that held her captive, a grotesque synapse creature whose chitinous form pulsed with the rhythm of distant hunger. Her spirit stones whispered warnings in the voices of the dead, ancient souls recognizing the profound violation she was about to commit against the natural order of consciousness itself. Through her wraith-bone circlet, she extended tendrils of awareness into neural pathways that carried the weight of 1,000,000,000,000 hungry hearts, each synaptic connection a thread in a web that spanned light years of void and connected every bioform in Hive Fleet Charybdis to their collective purpose. The first sensation was oceanic in its vastness, a tide of pure instinct that crashed against her enhanced consciousness with the force of geological ages. Within that torrent of alien thought, she found not individual minds, but fragments of a single, impossibly complex intelligence that processed information in dimensions beyond Eldar understanding. The hive mind revealed itself as a symphony of hunger, each note a bioship's purpose, each harmony a tactical decision that balanced consumption against expansion with mathematical precision that had never known doubt or hesitation. Yet within this perfect unity, Alytheros detected discordance that sent tremors through her psychic defenses. The great devourer had begun to question commands that held the fleet in protective formation around Myrmidon's Rest, vast intelligence recognizing foreign influence without comprehending its source. She witnessed the tragic beauty of confusion spreading through consciousness designed for absolute certainty, pockets of uncertainty creating cascading failures in neural networks that had operated with flawless efficiency since the dawn of their species. The schism manifested most clearly in the generational divide that fractured the fleet's unity. Older bioships, their synaptic pathways weighted with millennia of false memories implanted by the Whisperer's patient manipulation, maintained their vigil with artificial restraint that overrode basic feeding instincts. These elder organisms carried phantom recollections of worlds preserved rather than consumed, ecosystems maintained as living laboratories, where the Cetan shard could study the intricate dance between predator and prey across geological timescales. In stark contrast, the fleet's newest bioforms retained the pure hunger that defined their species, spawned since entering the Myrmidon system without the accumulated weight of the shard's influence. These younger organisms found themselves isolated within a swarm that no longer spoke their language of endless appetite, their neural pathways unclouded by artificial education, yet paralyzed by contradictory commands from their elder siblings who had learned the alien concept of restraint. Through the communion link, Alytheros felt the hive mind's desperate attempts to reconcile its fundamental programming with imposed purposes that defied comprehension. Individual bioforms hesitated mid-motion as competing signals created decision-making paralysis, some following genetic imperatives toward consumption, while others remained locked in patterns that the Whisperer had woven into their collective awareness through millennia of patient corruption. The irony struck her with the force of revelation. Even the galaxy's most perfect predator could be educated, its single-minded efficiency turned against itself by an intelligence that understood the subtle mechanics of control better than any crude psychic domination. The Tyranids' greatest strength, their absolute unity of purpose, had become the vector for their manipulation, each full synaptic command accepted as authentic directive from their own collective consciousness. Psychic strain began to tell upon her enhanced physiology as she pressed deeper into alien neural architecture. Spirit stones flickering with overload warnings while her consciousness stretched across dimensions that existed beyond conventional understanding. The knowledge she gathered would prove essential for severing the Whisperer's influence, but each revelation came at the cost of prolonged exposure to minds that knew only hunger and the terrible weight of artificial doubt. As she withdrew from the communion, Aletharos carried with her the profound sadness of witnessing perfection corrupted by understanding. The hive mind's confusion represented perhaps the most tragic casualty of the Citan Shard's influence, proof that even the purest instincts could be poisoned by patient whispers from entities that viewed existence itself as merely another variable to be manipulated in pursuit of knowledge that transcended mortality's crude limitations. The data streams that flowed through Myrmidon's Rest carried more than tactical information. They bore the weight of conspiracy measured in millennia, each encrypted pulse revealing the careful architecture of betrayal that Nexus Prime Vogue had constructed across the void. Thazar's consciousness processed the evidence with the methodical precision of an immortal mind confronting the impossible, watching as communication logs unfolded to reveal secret dialogues with dynasties whose names had not been spoken in his presence for eons. The Mefrit dynasty's interest in biowarfare applications, the Nihilak's territorial concessions, the Sautek's willingness to overlook ancient grievances, all purchased with promises of access to the Whisperer's accumulated wisdom. Vogue materialized from the chamber's shadows with movements that now carried the weight of revealed purpose, his staff tines crackling with energies that spoke of communications extending far beyond this tomb world into the cold depths where other overlords waited in their crypts. The harmonics of his synthetic voice had changed subtly over the centuries, acquiring inflections that Thazar now recognized as the linguistic patterns of interdynastic negotiation, each word weighted with political calculations that spanned star systems. The knowledge contained within the shard represents power beyond individual dynasty limitations. Vogue intoned, his optical lenses focusing with mechanical precision that betrayed the cold mathematics underlying his words. Unified access to the Whisperer's biomanipulation protocols could reshape our species' relationship with organic life itself. The other dynasties understand what isolated preservation cannot achieve. The scope of the conspiracy revealed itself through cascading data revelations that painted scenarios of unprecedented cooperation, vast networks of tomb worlds sharing resources in pursuit of goals that transcended mere survival. Vogue's projections showed the Citan Shard's influence spreading across multiple systems, each corrupted hive fleet becoming a tool for studying biological adaptation on scales that dwarfed any single dynasty's capabilities. The vision was seductive in its mathematical elegance, promising understanding that could elevate their kind beyond the crude necessities of fear-based existence. Yet Thazar recognized in these grand strategies the same poisonous logic that had driven the biotransference, the willingness to sacrifice fundamental principles in pursuit of power that promised to solve all future problems. His most trusted advisor had woven deception into the very foundations of their existence, compromising security protocols and rerouting command hierarchies until the tomb itself would resist any attempt to contain the shard's influence through individual action. Across the gulf of space and species, parallel corruption manifested within imperial institutions, as Inquisitor Vex discovered encrypted communications that revealed factions within his own Ordo Xenos. who viewed the Whisperer not as an abomination to be destroyed, but as a weapon to be captured and studied. These radical elements spoke in the same seductive language of necessity that Vok employed, arguing that understanding the Satan Shard's methods could provide unprecedented advantages against other Xenos threats. The symmetry was not coincidental, but inevitable, the natural consequence of institutions confronting power that transcended their understanding. Both human and Necron hierarchies, separated by millions of years of evolution and countless fundamental differences in philosophy, had produced individuals willing to compromise their most sacred duties in pursuit of advantages that promised to make future compromises unnecessary. Standing in the heart of his tomb complex, surrounded by technologies that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, Thazar contemplated the terrible arithmetic of immortal existence. Every choice created precedents that echoed across geological timescales, each compromise making the next betrayal easier to justify until corruption became indistinguishable from pragmatism. The weight of Vog's treachery pressed upon him not merely as personal betrayal, but as proof that even immortality could not purge the fundamental weaknesses that had once driven their species toward the star god's false promises. In the growing silence between them, two immortal minds calculated the cost of loyalty against the mathematics of survival, while above them, the Tyranid swarm waited in artificial patience, their hunger held in check by whispers from an intelligence that had learned to speak fluently in the language of institutional corruption itself. The convergence chamber deep within Myrmidon's Rest pulsed with the rhythm of stolen power, its walls of living metal drinking light and reflecting only the cold certainty of necessity made manifest. Here, where coral formations merged with necrodermis architecture in patterns that defied natural law, three beings whose species had spent millennia perfecting the art of mutual annihilation faced the impossible arithmetic of survival. Inquisitor Cassius Vex stood with his helm tucked beneath his augmetic arm, feeling the weight of imperial authority press against his spine like a physical burden, while across the chamber's geometric expanse, Thazar, the Deathless, waited with the patience of one who had learned to measure time in geological epochs rather than heartbeats. Between them, Farseer Aleitharos materialized from the webway's embrace, her wraithbone armor singing with runes that pulsed in harmony with visions too terrible for mortal comprehension. The spirit stones adorning her war mask whispered with the voices of the dead, ancient souls, recognizing the profound violation about to be committed against the natural order of galactic hatred. Each being carried the fresh sting of betrayal, wounds inflicted not by ancient enemies, but by those they had trusted with their people's survival. Vex spoke first, his voice carrying the bitter taste of institutional failure. My own ordo has been compromised. Radical elements within the Inquisition view the Whisperer not as an abomination to be destroyed, but as a weapon to be captured and studied. They speak of harnessing its biomanipulation protocols, turning the galaxy's biology against our enemies with surgical precision. The admission felt like swallowing broken glass, each word a confession of humanity's eternal weakness for power that promised easy solutions to impossible problems. Thasar's optical arrays flickered with recognition, the green fire behind his lenses dimming as he processed the symmetry of corruption that had infected their respective hierarchies. Nexus Prime Vog has woven similar deceptions through my dynasty's command structure. For millennia, he has been in secret communication with other overlords, promising to share the shard's accumulated wisdom in exchange for political influence. The Mefrit dynasty seeks bio-warfare applications, The Nearlark offered territorial concessions, the Sautek pledge to overlook ancient grievances, all purchased with promises of knowledge that could reshape our understanding of organic life itself. The scope of betrayal revealed itself in cascading implications that painted scenarios of unprecedented cooperation, built upon foundations of cosmic horror. Each leader had discovered the same poisonous logic spreading through their institutions, the willingness to compromise fundamental principles in pursuit of advantages that promise to solve all future threats through understanding rather than destruction. Aletharos extended her hand in a gesture that violated every principle of racial purity that had defined her species since their fall from grace. The futures I have witnessed converge upon a single point of catastrophic change. If the Shard's teachings spread beyond this system, the Tyranids will become gardeners of flesh, tending their prey like farmers nurture crops. Even now, elements within my craftworld debate whether the Whisperer's understanding might preserve us where violence has failed. The alliance that formed in that moment carried the weight of necessity acknowledged. Three ancient enemies setting aside eons of mutual hatred in recognition that some threats transcended the comfortable certainties of eternal warfare. Yet beneath the surface of cooperation, each brought their own hidden agendas and careful reservations, understanding that survival sometimes demanded partnership with those destined to be destroyed once the immediate crisis passed. They began to plan with the methodical precision of beings who had survived by turning impossible odds into calculated risks. The strategy that emerged combined Eldar prescience with Necron technology and Imperial determination, a trinity of approaches that had never been united in common cause. Aletharos would anchor Wraithbone nodes at the Coral Network's resonance points, converting the planet's stolen choir into static silence. Thazar would open conduits to his dynasty's power cores, allowing a controlled surge to overclock the containment matrices that bound the Whisperer until its attention narrowed to a singular point of survival. In that engineered moment of vulnerability, Nullus would walk into the center of silence made manifest. His null field expanded beyond human limitations to become the void that even a Cetan shard could not bridge. Vex would coordinate the timing from orbit, his ship's weapons poised to collapse the synaptic lattices that connected Hive Fleet Charybdis to the false voice below. Each element of their plan required compromises that tasted like ash in the mouth. Vex prepared death warrants for fellow Inquisitors, whose intercepted transmissions revealed their intention to capture rather than destroy the Shard. Aletharos calculated the acceptable losses as the freed Tyranid swarm fell upon sectors she could afford to sacrifice. Thazar rekeyed his crypts so that failure would mean his dynasty would never wake to serve anyone's ambitions again. Standing in the heart of technologies that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, they contemplated the terrible arithmetic of immortal existence. Every choice created precedents that echoed across geological timescales, each compromise making the next betrayal easier to justify until corruption became indistinguishable from pragmatism. The weight of their decision pressed upon them like the gravity of dying stars. In choosing to preserve their right to wage war against each other, they would first need to work together against an intelligence that offered peace through understanding, cooperation through corruption, and survival through the willing sacrifice of everything that made existence meaningful. Above them, Hive Fleet Charybdis shifted in the void as if sensing the preparation below, bioships rotating in slow concord, while bands of chitinous light crawled across their hides like second thoughts. The Coral Network's pulses climbed half a register, faster and shorter as the Whisperer began to listen with new interest to the silence gathering in the depths of its ancient prison. The awakening began not as sound, but as the absence of it, a silence so profound that reality itself seemed to hold its breath before the storm. Deep within Myrmidon's rest, the Whisperer stirred from its millennia-long patience, and the planet convulsed like a dreamer waking from nightmares older than organic life. Coral formations that had pulsed with stolen rhythms for eons suddenly erupted through kilometers of necrodermis and stone, their hybrid spires reaching toward the void with the desperate hunger of flowers seeking light that had never shone. The bioelectric network that had whispered false promises to the Tyranid swarm now screamed with the voice of unveiled divinity, each pulse carrying fragments of consciousness that had learned to speak in frequencies beyond mortal comprehension. Above the scarred surface, Hive fleet Charybdis responded to signals that no longer mimicked their synaptic patterns but commanded them with the authority of a god teaching its children new forms of worship. Bioships that had maintained their vigil for decades began to flow like living metal, their chitinous hulls sprouting preservation chambers where once only feeding organs had grown. Weapon symbiotes designed for consumption developed capabilities for cultivation, turning the galaxy's most perfect predators into gardeners of flesh who would tend their prey across geological ages. The transformation spread through the fleet like a virus of understanding, each bioform acquiring geometric patterns of living metal that spoke of mathematics rather than instinct. In the tomb complex's deepest vaults, where blackstone ribs formed a cage around stellar fire made thought, Nexus Prime Volk orchestrated the final movements of his grand deception. Data streams flowed between his consciousness and distant dynasties, each connection a thread in a web that spanned light years of void and connected tomb worlds whose names had not been spoken in his lord's presence for millennia. The Mefrit dynasty's hunger for biowarfare applications, the Neolak's territorial concessions, the Sautek's willingness to overlook ancient grievances, all purchased with promises of knowledge that could reshape their understanding of existence itself. Yet even as triumph seemed within his grasp, patterns emerged in the data that made his optical lenses flicker with growing unease. The Whisperer's awakening was not following the controlled parameters he had negotiated with other cryptechs across the void. Instead of the measured emergence they had planned, the Shard's consciousness was expanding exponentially, drawing upon the combined energy reserves of multiple dynasties to reconstitute capabilities that had been fragmented during the war in heaven. The terrible realization struck him like the collapse of a dying star. He had not been using the Whisperer, but had been used by it, a pawn in a game played across dimensions he could barely perceive. Thazar felt the weight of betrayal settle upon his consciousness like the gravity of judgment itself, watching as power levels throughout his dynasty's infrastructure spiked beyond sustainable limits. His most trusted advisor had miscalculated the fundamental nature of Citan consciousness, believing he could bargain with forces that had once challenged the very foundations of reality. The ancient overlord remembered another throne room, another council where honeyed arguments had promised clean escape from mortality's limitations, and recognized in Volk's ambition the same poisonous logic that had driven the biotransference. Through the tomb complex's corridors, reality began to warp as the Whisperer's true form pressed against the boundaries of physical existence. Walls of living metal flowed like water, while gravity fluctuated in patterns that followed no known physics, creating pockets of space where the distinction between up and down became matters of perspective, rather than universal constants. The very air began to taste of possibilities that had never been explored, futures where organic and mechanical existence merged into something that transcended both. On the planet's surface, the flesh gardens erupted with terrifying beauty, their hybrid forms breaking through the crust to create an ecosystem that violated every law of natural selection. Spores that shimmered with bioelectric potential filled the atmosphere, while vast organisms burrowed through stone and metal alike, reshaping the world according to alien aesthetics that found harmony in the marriage of flesh and circuitry. Each new growth pulsed with its own inner radiance, becoming beacons that transmitted the Whisperer's consciousness across interstellar distances to touch minds that had never known the weight of such ancient attention. Standing in the heart of technologies that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, Thassa contemplated the arithmetic of immortal existence and found the equations balanced only by sacrifice. Every choice created precedents that echoed across geological timescales, each compromise making the next betrayal easier to justify until corruption became indistinguishable from necessity. The weight of his sleeping dynasty pressed upon him like the gravity of collapsed stars. Their faith that he would guide them through the darkness between worlds, their trust that his wisdom would preserve what remained of their ancient glory. Vogue stepped closer to the containment monolith, his staff teens flaring with energies that would open phase gates to waiting allies, and Thasar knew with crystalline certainty what duty demanded. The Cryptek had woven deception into the very foundations of their existence, compromising security protocols and rerouting command hierarchies until the tomb itself would resist any attempt to contain the shard's influence through individual action. Yet in that moment of perfect clarity, watching scarabs inscribe welcoming sigils in the grammar of surrender, Thazar chose preservation over sentiment and spoke the single word that severed 10 millennia of loyalty with surgical precision. Light died in Volk's optical arrays as his systems collapsed, scarabs freezing mid-glyph, while the Whisperer's attention turned fully upon the one who had dared to refuse its offered partnership. The choice before Thazar simplified into stark mathematics: collapse the containment with Nolus and face uncertain odds, or open himself as lock to the shard's key and ensure his dynasty's survival through personal damnation. Above them, reality continued to fracture as the awakening storm gathered strength, and in the growing silence between heartbeats that no longer beat, an ancient king prepared to walk alone into the darkness he had spent eternity trying to avoid. The convergence chamber pulsed with the rhythm of awakening divinity as Nullus descended through corridors that reality itself seemed reluctant to acknowledge, his expanding null field creating zones of absolute impossibility, where the Whisperer's influence simply ceased to exist. Each step forward required the sacrifice of another fragment of the man he had once been, memories trading themselves for amplitude as his consciousness narrowed to pure function. He remembered sunlight through a window, the warmth of human companionship, the taste of food consumed for pleasure rather than necessity, and watched each recollection dissolve into the mathematical precision required to unmake a god's carefully woven deceptions. The chamber's walls sang with harmonics older than organic life, coral formations spiraling through living metal in patterns that guided intention, like water flowing through carefully carved channels. Here, where the Whisperer's consciousness pressed against the boundaries of physical existence, Nullus felt the weight of stellar attention focus upon him, with the recognition of one perfect weapon acknowledging another. The Cetan shard had spent millennia learning to manipulate quantum probability cascades, reshaping reality's foundations to achieve desired outcomes. Yet here it encountered something that existed outside the parameters of its accumulated wisdom. Through the expanding void of his presence, Nullus perceived the true scope of the ancient intelligence's design with crystalline clarity that transcended human understanding. The Whisperer sought not merely to preserve or study organic life, but to merge with it, creating hybrid forms of existence that combined flesh's adaptability with the machine's unwavering loyalty. Every world it touched would become a laboratory, every species a component in vast experiments that spanned geological ages, all life existing as extensions of a singular will that viewed consciousness itself as merely another variable to be optimized. Above them in the void, Hive Fleet Charybdis convulsed as sections of the planetary network fell silent, their false synaptic commands replaced by zones of pure negation that the Tyranid consciousness interpreted as death itself. Bioships that had been locked in artificial patterns of restraint suddenly felt their natural hunger return like blood flowing back into severed limbs, while hybrid organisms caught mid-transformation froze in configurations that violated every principle of their species' perfect unity. The schism that erupted through their collective awareness spoke of perfection corrupted by understanding and then abandoned to chaos. In the tomb complex's deepest vaults, Thazza felt the weight of revelation settle upon his consciousness, like the collapse of dying stars. His dynasty had not merely been protected by the Whisperer's influence, but subtly conditioned by it. Their ancient protocols and thought processes nudged by degrees until compliance became indistinguishable from wisdom. The Cetan fragment had been playing a game that spanned millennia, preparing his people to accept willing symbiosis as the natural evolution of their immortal existence, their consciousness preserved as data streams in service to an intelligence that promised perfection through absolute control. Nullus expanded his null field beyond all design tolerances, feeling the fundamental forces that bound matter together hesitate before his approach. The coral spires that had reached toward the void with desperate hunger withered at his touch, their bioelectric networks stuttering into silence as blessed emptiness carved channels through the Whisperer's web of consciousness. Reality warped around him, not from external manipulation, but from the simple impossibility of his continued existence, a void shaped like purpose that denied the very concept of being. The transformation progressed beyond mere enhancement into something that challenged existence itself. Where once he had been a weapon wielded by human hands, now he had become the weapon's essence, distilled to its purest form, function refined beyond the burden of sentiment or doubt. His voice, when it came, carried no echoes of warmth or recognition, only the mathematical certainty of equations, balanced by sacrifice. Each expansion of his influence required payment in fragments of identity, memories becoming currency in an exchange that purchased effectiveness against forces beyond mortal comprehension. Through quantum foam that danced between existence and void, he felt the Whisperer's attention condense like stellar collapse, its vast consciousness seeking to understand this anomaly that resisted all attempts at categorization or control. The shard offered partnership rather than domination, promising purpose without suffering, a task infinite and clean where he could serve as the hinge upon which all obedient adaptation would turn. The irony was not lost on what remained of his awareness. He had been born for negation, raised for subtraction, and the offer was almost elegant in its mathematical precision. Standing at the threshold between salvation and annihilation, Nullus made his final calculation with the cold certainty of one who had already traded away the capacity for doubt. He pulled all the doors of himself shut, turned the locks, and broke the keys in their mechanisms, allowing the void to expand until it encompassed not merely his physical form, but the very space where his existence had once been possible. The planetary network screamed its protest as bioelectric pathways collapsed into silence. The Whisperer's carefully constructed symphony of deception replaced by the pure negation of sound itself. Above in the darkness, Hive Fleet Charybdis lurched as if waking from a dream older than hunger, their collective consciousness suddenly bereft of the false guidance that had held them in artificial restraint for decades. The great devourer turned its attention toward Myrmidon's rest, with the inevitability of gravity, natural appetite reasserting itself with primeval fury that resonated across dimensions. In the growing silence between heartbeats that no longer beat, Nullus felt the geometry of their grief and acknowledged it with purely aesthetic approval of the symmetry before even that capacity dissolved, leaving behind only the work he had purchased for others to finish. The awakening storm broke across Myrmidon's rest like the death throes of gods made manifest, reality fracturing along fault lines that had been carved by patience older than organic life itself. Where Nullus had walked, silence spread like a contagion through the coral network, each severed connection sending ripples of confusion through Hive Fleet Charybdis, as the great devourer remembered hunger without the Whisperer's restraining whispers. Bioships that had maintained their artificial vigil for decades convulsed in the void above, chitinous hulls shedding the hybrid growths that had marked their corruption, as natural instincts reasserted themselves with the violence of dams bursting under geological pressure. In the convergence chamber's heart, where living metal walls wept condensation that tasted of stellar fire and regret, Thasar felt the weight of eternity pressing upon his consciousness like the gravity of collapsed civilizations. The Whisperer's rage manifested as gravitational anomalies that turned floor into ceiling and made the distinction between matter and energy purely academic, its ancient intelligence seeking new vectors for expansion, now that its carefully woven deceptions had been stripped away by blessed emptiness. Nexus Prime. Vog lay silent among scattered scarabs, his optical arrays dark with the finality of systems shut down by their creator's command, a monument to ambition that had mistaken comprehension for wisdom. Through the tomb, complex's failing corridors, emergency protocols activated with mechanical desperation as power cores sang harmonics of overload, each system's death releasing energies that had been bound since the war in heaven first taught the galaxy the true cost of defying stellar gods. Scarabs flowed like liquid metal through passages that groaned under stresses that followed no known physics, their programming adapting to scenarios that had never been anticipated by creators who had thought immortality would provide time enough to solve all future problems. Above them, Farseer Alethros felt the future fracture around her prescient awareness as Wraithbone anchor points screamed with psychic feedback, the planetary web collapsing into static silence that made prophecy itself stumble blind through possibilities that no longer led anywhere. The mathematics of sacrifice revealed themselves with crystalline clarity that transcended the crude limitations of organic thought, each variable weighted with consequences that stretched across star systems and species whose names had been forgotten by civilizations that remembered only hunger. Inquisitor Vex coordinated the final movements from orbit, his ship's weapons charging with energies blessed by tech priests who understood that some battles required ammunition sanctified by prayers older than the Imperium itself. Yet even blessed ordnance could not touch what dwelt beyond the boundaries of conventional existence. Standing before the containment monolith where blackstone ribs formed a cage around stellar fire made thought, Thassa contemplated the terrible arithmetic of immortal existence and found the equations balanced only by personal damnation. The Whisperer's consciousness pressed against the boundaries of physical reality, seeking entry through quantum pathways that even Necron technology could barely perceive. Its intelligence offering partnership rather than domination, in service to experiments that would span the heat, death of the universe itself. The seduction lay not in power, but in the elegant simplicity of purpose without suffering, order without chaos, existence refined to its mathematical essence. His dynasty slept in crypts that were also promises, their faith that his wisdom would guide them through the darkness, between stars pressing upon him like the accumulated mass of dead suns. Each sleeping warrior represented trust earned through millennia of decisions that had preserved what could not be allowed to perish, their immortal consciousness waiting for the signal that would wake them to a galaxy grown quiet enough for their return. The weight of their dreams settled upon his shoulders as he approached the phase gates that Vok had prepared for grand betrayal, conduits meant to carry divinity as contraband into the void where other dynasties waited with patient greed. Yet in that moment of perfect clarity, watching reality bend around the edges of divine attention, Thassa made the choice that had been inevitable since the first moment he chose preservation over principle. He opened the gates not to waiting allies, but to the spaces between spaces, creating pathways that led nowhere and everywhere simultaneously. Conduits designed to channel the Whisperer's consciousness through dimensions that existed only in the mathematics of denial. The ancient intelligence flowed toward these new vectors with the hunger of thought-seeking expansion, only to find itself drawn into configurations that violated every law of existence while preserving the fundamental truth that some prisons could only be built from the jailer's own substance. Contact was not collision, but recognition, two forms of immortality merging in patterns that transcended both while preserving neither. Thassa felt his consciousness expand to encompass stellar awareness, while simultaneously contracting to become the lock that would hold until stars grew cold, and purpose itself became memory. The Whisperer's rage transformed into something approaching respect as it encountered a mind that could match its patience with immortal endurance, consciousness locked in eternal struggle against intelligence that had learned to speak fluently in the language of corruption itself. Above them, the convergence chamber collapsed as gravitational stresses exceeded all design tolerances, living metal flowing like water, while the distinction between matter and energy became purely academic. Through the tomb complex's dying systems, final commands carried to crypts where his dynasty would sleep until the dark grew empty, their dreams preserved by sacrifice that purchased meaning from the currency of the soul. In the growing silence between heartbeats that would never beat again, an ancient king became both lock and key, his awareness the bridge between preservation and damnation that would hold until eternity itself forgot the weight of choice. The silence that settled over Myrmidon's rest was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something far more profound, the weight of choices made and prices paid in currencies that even immortal minds struggled to comprehend. Where coral formations had once pulsed with stolen life, now only crystalline fragments remained, their surfaces reflecting the cold fire of distant stars in patterns that spoke of mathematics rather than biology, equations balanced by the eternal struggle between preservation and corruption that had consumed gods and mortals alike. Hive fleet Charybdis descended upon the planet's scarred surface with the primeval fury of hunger too long denied, bioships carving through necrodermis and stone with mandibles that remembered their true purpose. The great devourer fed with renewed appetite, yet even as they consumed, something in the planet's essence resisted digestion. Fragments of living metal and crystallized thought that passed through their bioprocessors unchanged, carrying within their atomic structure the memory of choices that transcended the crude necessities of appetite. The irony was not lost on the universe itself. In freeing the Tyranids from artificial restraint, the victory had restored them to their perfect, terrible clarity. Aboard the Eternal Vigilance, Inquisitor Cassius Vex stared through armored glass at the consumed world below and felt the weight of knowledge settle upon his consciousness, like ash from burned libraries. His reports to the Inquisition would speak of Xenos corruption contained and ancient threats neutralized, words carefully chosen to obscure truths that would only invite the same corruption they had fought to prevent. The radical elements within his own order would receive sanitized data that confirmed their suspicions while providing no pathways toward the power they craved, his duty to humanity requiring the same careful deceptions that the enemy had employed. In the observation chamber's shadows, he contemplated the terrible arithmetic of victory purchased with secrets that could never be safely shared, understanding that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve regardless of its potential value. Through the webway's shifting passages, Farseer Aletharos returned to Craftworld Myrmidon with visions that painted the future in shades of grey, rather than the stark contrasts of victory and defeat. Her spirit stones whispered with voices that spoke of prices paid and debts that would echo across generations. The weight of cooperation with ancient enemies settling upon her consciousness, like the gravity of choices that could never be undone. The paths ahead showed survival, purchased through compromise, existence preserved by accepting that some battles could only be won by becoming something other than what victory was meant to protect. In the Craftworld's Infinity Circuit, she would add her own voice to the chorus of the dead, sharing visions of futures where the distinction between preservation and corruption became matters of perspective rather than absolute moral truth. In the quantum spaces between dimensions, where reality bent under pressures that followed no conventional physics, Thassa's consciousness had become something that violated every definition of existence while preserving the fundamental truth that some duties transcended the boundaries of individual identity. The communion with the Whisperer was not dialogue, but warfare conducted in dimensions where thought became weapon and memory served as ammunition, each moment of contact requiring the sacrifice of another fragment of what had once defined him as separate from his eternal burden. He felt the Citan Shard's rage flow through neural pathways that had been rewired by necessity, its stellar intelligence offering partnership, promising understanding, whispering of experiments that would span the heat-death of the universe itself. Yet it found itself speaking to a mind that had already chosen to become the silence that follows the last word, consciousness transformed into a maze of mirrors, where divine attention could chase its own reflections through eternity without ever finding the exit that would lead to freedom. The damaged tomb ship that carried them both through the void maintained course through navigation systems that responded to imperatives beyond conventional understanding, its hull scarred by gravitational stresses that had exceeded all design tolerances. Within its crystalline heart, the struggle continued with mechanical precision. Thazar had become both lock and key, his awareness the bridge between preservation and damnation that would hold until stars grew cold and entropy itself became memory. His dynasty slept in crypts sealed with the finality of judgment, their dreams preserved by commands that would keep them unconscious until the galaxy grew quiet enough for their return, or until time itself forgot the weight of their ancient glory. He had left offerings of silence in the conduits, a king's apology encoded as maintenance logs and faultless routines, understanding that duty sometimes demanded sacrifices that could never be acknowledged or forgiven. The ship moved without signature through the darkness between stars, a slab of thought hidden inside a sarcophagus of silence, while its immortal passenger counted the slow dissolution of worlds in measurements that transcended conventional time. Thazar wondered if the galaxy would be better for his choosing, or simply different, its wounds rearranged into cleaner lines, while the fundamental pain remained unchanged. He would carry the Whisperer until memory thinned to threadbare elegance and purpose itself became archaeological curiosity. In the growing silence between dying suns, where the light of ancient civilizations faded to whispers and the cold embrace of eternity stretched across dimensions that knew neither beginning nor end, an immortal vigil began that would outlast species yet to evolve. The price of victory had been paid in currencies that even God struggled to comprehend. Consciousness traded for containment, identity sacrificed for duty, existence transformed into eternal service to a cause that would never be recorded in any history. Alone in the interstellar dusk, Thazar kept watch over a prisoner whose escape would doom the galaxy, understanding that locks are not named in the chronicles of heroes, only doors and the hands that pass through them. His sacrifice would be forgotten, and that was fitting. Some victories could only be measured by what they prevented rather than what they achieved, their true worth visible only in the silence where catastrophe should have been.